It's great to have Mark and Lori with us. We're shameless in that we will put people to work if they're going to show up. So, guess what, Mark? How about you lead some songs? Uh, it's all good. It's great to see him. As I said in an email, I hope you saw that they have to head right back to Tulsa today. So they're not going to be able to linger afterward. And I know some of you would love to catch up and talk. Well, that was what the donuts were for this morning. Um, Also, today, Marcia and I are celebrating 40 years of marriage. Um, and I was thinking, I thought, and some of you have been around for three-quarters of that, and then that's kind of incredible. Because as a kid, we moved all the time, and I never had any relationships that lasted more than about 4 years. And so the idea that now I have relationships that go back 30 years, I wouldn't have expected that starting out. This morning, as we talk about this passage from Philippians chapter 4, I want to start with a little quote that I get a daily email from the Enneagram Institute, and this is one of the things that it said, oh, it was probably a month ago. It says, psychology without spirituality is arid and ultimately meaningless, while spirituality without grounding in psychological work leads to vanity and illusions. And I really thought about that. I think by spirituality, because spirituality can have a lot of meanings, but at least the way I'm reading it in this statement is without a sense of something transcendent beyond yourself, something metaphysical to which you are relating. So it's saying that psychology without some transcendent aspect. In other words, if all we're thinking about is the dynamics of our own personality, the internal working of our own mind, how we think, how we go about, perceiving the world. If that's all we're doing without some aspect of a transcendent, larger reality than just ourselves, psychology without that spirituality, well, it'll be arid and ultimately meaningless. It's just navel gazing. It's just you looking at yourself. But then the other flip side was spirituality. In other words, a sense of the transcendent, of the metaphysical without grounding in psychological work. It leads to vanity and illusions. And I really like the statements, why I copied it, and I have this running file where a document where I just keep pasting in every good thing I run across so I can go back and look at them later. And this morning, I thought this was particularly pertinent. It was important for looking at what Paul's talking about. Because it seems to me that Paul is saying some things that are very much about our psychological self, how we think. And he's encouraging these Christians to do some very deliberate work psychologically in terms of their perception of the world, in terms of how they interpret, parse things, how they put them together, how they, construct their own reality. Because basically we do. We construct a kind of reality in our heads that we believe is somehow accurate, mirroring the outside world. And through it, we're trying to interpret things, make sense of things. And my sense is that Paul's words need to be read in that frame, as if he is encouraging us to do some inner work, but also it is from a spiritual frame of reference. It is from the perspective of, but there's things much greater than you, to which you are trying to relate the ordinariness of your life and trying to put that together in some sort of cogent way, cohesive framework. So in talking about it this morning, I want to also bring up a term that I don't know when it started being used, but it's, to me, fairly recent. Didn't hear this decades ago. But today we talk about agency. And the idea is that we each have a certain capability. We have a kind of power, a kind of ability Each one of us. So today we seem to refer to that as agency. In the past, maybe it was just, we just talked about what you were capable of doing. But maybe we ourselves have sometimes in our thinking felt utterly and completely helpless. You know, where you're in a situation and you're thinking, there's just nothing I can do. I have no agency, right? Or maybe we recognize it more when we're listening to someone else and they're going on and their situation is utterly hopeless. There's nothing they can do. And you're kind of thinking, I think there are some things you could do, right? And sometimes you listen and they just absolutely swear, there's nothing I could absolutely do about this situation. And while it may be true, they may not be able to do anything to change the circumstances that are going on. It is beyond them. There's always something we can do. We always have some agency, and if nothing else, it is how I respond to the circumstances beyond my control. My response, I have to take ownership for. I can't say, I'm just forced to respond this way. No, I can respond in a different way, a different manner. And so some of this psychological work, I think, is realizing that we do have agency. Each one of us has a certain capability, that none of us are utterly and completely helpless in any situation. Sometimes we can affect what is actually transpiring. Sometimes we can't. But we can always have some effect on how we are then going to live in terms of what is happening. I'm a very big fan of systems theory in terms of family dynamics. And what's really nice about systems theory in terms of family dynamics and family counseling is that there are no problem people. Sometimes in more classical counseling, the family's looked at and who's the problem here? Is it the teenage child? You know, the teenagers always bear the brunt of being the problem. They're the issue, right? But family systems theory says you don't label anyone as the problem. The problem isn't anyone in the system. The problem exists in the system, and everyone is participating in the problem. Everyone has got some role they're playing in the dynamic of what's happening. And so the really good news about this approach to counseling is that in the more kind of classical approach where this person's the problem, you got to get this person to go to counseling. And often this person doesn't want to go to counseling. But in the family systems approach, there's the realization that all of us and each one of us can have an effect on the dynamic of the situation because we're all giving input into it. And often the approach is actually perhaps the most mature people are the best positioned to affect a change. And you might be thinking, yes, but it's this immature person in the situation that's causing the chaos or the problem. I know, maybe there's a part of that. But the most mature people can often affect change simply by changing their participation in the situation, right? So they've got agency. I think it's very hopeful because when someone's in a relationship with another person who doesn't want to address it, you can still talk to the person who's saying, but there's a problem. And the question is, well, what can you do to address what's going on, irrespective of whether the other person participates in some sort of counseling or dialogue? You can still affect some change. In other words, there's real hope there because there's agency. So what I think about when I'm reading this text is, as I mentioned last week, Paul is talking to these Philippian Christians about being joyful, particularly because they are not. And when we read, starting in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I will say rejoice, it is an imperative. It's in the command form. The verb is a command. And you might think, well, how can I muster up joy? You just tell me I have to be joyful, like, I'll just, try and grit my teeth and be joyful. How do I make myself just deliberately joyful? Isn't it something that has to kind of arise apart from my effort? Well, there's a part of that that's true, but Paul is telling them, rejoice. Look, folks, rejoice. The other thing about the verb is it's plural. And I don't think it's plural because he's saying all of you as individuals rejoice individually, but I'm speaking to all of you as individuals. Every verb in this section's they're all plurals. It's all you plural. I think there's a very big communal dynamic to what he's talking about. No, all by my little lonesome, it's going to be hard to kind of conjure up joy out of the ether, but nothing's joyful. How can I muster up some joy? He's telling me I need to rejoice. But there's more hope in that happening, I think, in a communal environment. Because just like sometimes we believe for one another, I like that idea. Maybe you've heard the saying that when I can't believe, perhaps you believe for me. Because we're part of a community. And there's times when none of us feel like belief is very possible. But then we see someone else who's still continuing to trust. And that somehow encourages us. That somehow they haven't lost their sense of hope or trust in God. So the verbs are plural. There is, I believe, Paul's insinuation that we have the capacity, the agency to actually rejoice according to his instruction. Now, a lot has to take place in order to do that. Perhaps some of what has to take place is what I'm actually centering my mind on, right? Because it's going to be hard to rejoice if what I'm rehearsing in my mind is a litany of all the terrible things that I'm experiencing. But perhaps some of where I have some agency is I do have the ability to decide, not that it's going to be easy, but to make the intentional decision to try and focus my mind in some other places, maybe away from the things that I cannot change. Like I mentioned to the children during children's time, the greatest sense of joy is that we are loved. And that's not just kind of a theoretical thing, and that's why the verbs need to be plural, that we can love one another and actually sense it. And all of that is a reminder and an indication that we know we are loved by God, because it is God through each of us loving the other, that we are experiencing a kind of reality to what it is we profess to be the shape of all things. That it's about love, that love is the basis, substance, and structure of everything, and that experiencing that love and sharing that love, a communal involvement, is in fact a source of great joy. So Paul is able to say in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I will say, I'm going to emphasize, folks, rejoice. He's telling them, find your joy, right? That's what he's telling them. He goes on to say, and these can seem like detached, somewhat arbitrary statements. You could read them as like, he's just ADHD, he's just going rejoice and then be gentle. And, like his mind is just flipping from thing to thing and there's no thread of continuity. But I think there really is, right? There is a thread of continuity. He starts off saying this rejoice, a command to find their joy, and he repeats it. And then the very next thing is, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. And then what I see is a bridge statement, the Lord is near. The statement, the Lord is near, not only affects and is related to what has already come, but it is certainly going to shape what follows. But what is the connection between finding their joy and being people of gentleness. Well, angry people don't come across to me as very gentle, right? I don't know that I've ever met anyone who's lacking in joy, who's kind of gruff and stern and whatever's coming out, it's not gentle. So I think there's a natural flow. And here's where, again, we're talking kind of the psychological aspects, the psychological work we must do. If I want to be a person of gentleness, and it's a fruit of the Spirit, and yes, that means it is gifted by the Spirit, but I believe it also means we have to incorporate it within ourselves. It is truly the gift of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, all these things. The joy is a gift. It's given to me. But here Paul's telling them, go ahead and get on with it, right? It's a gift, and yet they have their part in bringing it to fruition in their own lives. It is a fruit of the Spirit within them with which they cooperate. So there's this connection between joy and gentleness. I believe what Paul is saying is if these Philippians, who, if you read the whole letter, you see there's some conflict going on in this church. If they can find their joy, there will be a lot less being at odds. Because you know how it is. When we're upset with one thing, we tend to then be upset with everything. I'm bad about that, right? If one thing's not going well, Marcia can sense it. And it's got nothing to do with her, but I'm just in a bad state of mind, right? It's like the boss mistreats you and you go home and kick the dog, right? And the dog's thinking, what did I do? But you're just upset, right? But finding a kind of anchor place with joy, I believe, brings out this capacity then to be gentle in other situations. I'm a lot more patient with others when I have a centeredness in a joyfulness. Then others don't get on my nerves as much. They don't tend to annoy me as much. We could bring in other terms like peace, that those are also involved in what's going on. So the second thing is, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. And this is really the Advent part, I think, of this passage. The nearness of the Lord. I mean, this is what Advent is about. We're waiting for Jesus. The whole focus of these 4 weeks are to set ourselves in a kind of frame where we know that Jesus is ever coming and ever near to us, and we need to make that the way we focus, a kind of renewed focus for our lives. And so right here in the middle of these 4 verses, the end of 5, the statement, the Lord is near, Advent. He is on the verge of appearing. And a sense of that nearness of the Lord then can affect so much else in our lives. So he goes on in verse 6, be anxious for nothing. I mean, if I reflect on the reality, and that itself can be a source of joy, the nearness of the Lord, right? I can take a great sense of well-being. I like that as a definition of joy, that all will be well. Maybe right now there's a number of things that are going on that are not well, but if there can be an abiding sense that all will be well, and with God all is well. In the greater picture, things are well with me, with my life, then there can be a sense of joy. So he asked them to ponder the nearness of the Lord, then be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. When he's being realistic, do you have things that concern you? Well, yes, we've got a list. We're thinking about them incessantly, right? And they're making us, kind of on edge and tense and anxious. And Paul says, well, I'm not denying the fact that those are there, But his recommendation is remember the nearness of the Lord and then pour those things out to God. All those things. The things that you make petition about, the supplication, all sorts of prayer. But don't forget the thanksgiving, right? Which is in keeping with the joy. I've got to remember the things for which I am thankful. So he says, make all of this known to God because the Lord is near. And then comes the promise in verse 7. I don't think it's an easy promise. I don't think it's an instant promise. I think it takes our deliberate effort. I wish it were the case that while I'm keeping my mind centered on all the things agitating me, that this overwhelming sense of peace would just fill my life. It doesn't tend to work that way, right? It doesn't tend to push itself in, push out the worries, and then kind of flood me with a sense of well-being and joy and peace and all these wonderful virtues of the Spirit. No, more realistically, there's the work I have to do, the psychological work in tandem with the spiritual realities. And the psychological work is about those spiritual realities. It's remembering there is the God who loves me. There is the Lord who is near. And so finally in verse 7, and the peace of God which surpasses all comprehension will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It will be the case. It won't happen instantly. It's not constant. In other words, there's times of disruption. There's times of renewed worry and concern. And we have to bring ourselves back very deliberately and make ourselves be in that space where we are thankful, where we remember that all is well in ways that may not be always evident in everything. But the promise is the peace of God, which goes beyond our ability to comprehend. Someone might wonder, well, if it's beyond comprehension, does that mean I just can never know it? I mean, that kind of sounds like, how will I ever know it? And I like to make a distinction with two words, to apprehend and to comprehend. And I don't remember who I got this from. I get everything from someone, so I just have forgotten who to attribute it to. But to apprehend something is to know it. To comprehend it is to know it completely. We cannot comprehend the love of God, but we can apprehend the love of God. We cannot comprehend the peace of God, but we can apprehend it. He's not saying this is beyond your ability to know. He's saying it's so expansive and extensive that you'll know you don't know all of it, but you are able to know the reality of something expanded far beyond your capacity to pull completely in to yourself. In other words, you're in touch with something much greater than you, with the transcendent. He's talking about a kind of peace which is on the level of the transcendent, not the temporal. Not kind of earthly peace, not something simple and small, but something so grand that you can never take it all in. But that is what you come to know. And you know that you are a participant in this peace of God. So the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It's interesting that he chooses this language of guarding, somehow keeping us safe. Again, not necessarily keeping away all anxiety, everything that might cause us some degree of struggle or worry, of hardship, but ultimately guarding. Julian of Norwich has a famous saying, all will be well, all will be well, and in the end, all will be very well. She was stating what is the reality that she clung to, I think, in moments when all was not well, right? And there's lots of moments where all is not well in this specific circumstance with what is happening. And again, we're not talking about the denial of those realities, but we are affirming that somehow we can be guarded by a knowledge that there's a peace which surpasses both our comprehension and our explanation. You know you're apprehending it when someone wants you to describe it and make sense of it, and you're kind of like, I don't know if I can. I mean, I can tell you some things about it, but all of it will be somewhat inadequate because it's something I know which surpasses knowledge. It's something I'm experiencing which surpasses my ability to wrap my arms around it. In some ways, I think we're talking about a kind of spiritual maturity where we have come into a place of spaciousness in the spirit. There's openness, there's hope and possibility, there's joy and peace, and it can still be there even when everything's in turmoil and when my life is not where I want it to be. So I titled my thoughts, Focus Renewed, right? When I see the signs of my own discontent, my own anxiousness, those are signs pointing me back to the work of needing to renew my focus because I've become too focused on things that are distressing. And I need to remember at the same time, there are grounding things that are much greater, more dependable than whatever it is causing me distress, worry, or dismay. So in our Advent waiting, we remember the Lord is near. And that makes all the difference in how we experience each day. May God bless us in remembering his presence.